Africa. Kalle udu si hai. Samaya do ipatla sabo pino. Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Ramaphosa re-election, rising rates, and further tensions episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. In December 2022, for the South Africa update, we look at the failed impeachment attempt against President Cyril Ramaphosa, the resignation of Eskom CEO, and the suspension of Judge Hlophe. In the Africa Regional Update, we look at the ECOWAS 62nd Ordinary Summit, the latest milestones towards civilian rule in Sudan, and the latest status report on progress towards SDGs in Africa. And in the Global Geopolitics Update, we look at the China-Latin America Defense Forum, the U.S. Fed raising rates again, and the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. With me this episode is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this month?
Yes, hi Sia. I'm well, thank you, man. I'm doing fine. It's holiday season is upon us again, so I'm a bit tired, but in high spirits because finally we get to rest. Yeah.
Definitely. I'm in the same boat. That year-end fatigue is kicking in, but I'm glad to be at the final stretch of this year, which was quite a long and eventful year, if I must say so.
Yeah, it was a very, very long year and a half.
Definitely. And then a reminder to all our listeners, regardless of whatever platform you're listening through, please hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all future updates. And if you're enjoying this episode, share it amongst your family and friends and hit the like button. On that note, let's get started on the SA update in brief. So the Monetary Policy Committee increased the repurchase rate by 75 basis points to 7% on the 25th of November. The SADC Extraordinary Ministerial Committee on Politics, Defense and Security met on the 30th of November, and GDP increased by 1.6% in the third quarter of 2022. Meanwhile, manufacturing production increased by 1% year-on-year, despite decreasing by 6.3% on a month-to-month basis in October, and mining production decreased by 10.4% year-on-year, and decreased by 2.5% on a month-to-month basis in October. Meanwhile, Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor led the South African delegation to the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit on the 14th of December, and government achieved 10 out of the 26 structural reforms under Operation Vulindlela for the third quarter of 2022-2023. Smoo, any thoughts on these updates?
Yeah, well, man, we have been told that our GDP has to increase by at least 3% to make any difference, make any dent in the high unemployment rates, in the in just a stagnant economy. So at 1.6%, that's too low, but it's still a good story. So manufacturing production and mining production are also affected by the continuing blackouts. I mean, we go for about for close to 6 hours or 6 hours or even more per day. So how can you produce anything when half the day you're not working? The government achieves 10 of 26 structural reforms. I mean, there you have it. I mean, not in achieving half of what we set out to do. So we need to do much better in the coming year.
Most definitely. As a country, I think we have our work cut out for us. We just have to roll up our sleeves and get working. On that note, that takes us to the first story in the SA update. A National Assembly votes against Cyril Ramaphosa's impeachment. So the National Assembly debated the report of the independent panel established to investigate whether there was prima facie evidence to institute an impeachment inquest against President Cyril Ramaphosa in terms of Section 89 of the South African Constitution. Political parties represented in the National Assembly expressed mixed views on the report's recommendations that the president has a case to answer following the controversial robbery at the president's farm involving a large amount of money in foreign currency. However, only 149 members of the National Assembly, including 5 members of the ANC ruling party, voted to adopt the report and establishing impeachment proceedings against President Ramaphosa, versus 214 votes against this. Sbu?
Yeah, well, once again, the ruling party used its majority in parliament to suppress a legal proceeding. It is almost like deja vu, where the majority political party chooses to defend their own, despite there being a constitutional court judgment that admonished all parliamentarians for voting according to a predetermined party line instead of their conscience and constitutional obligations. So the other factor for me is that the ANC were, just only a week away from their own elective conference. So this could have been one. This could have been a factor, but I don't know. I think I am giving them an excuse here, but their excuse was, let's rather let the branches of the political party decide on their leadership and not let opposition parties in parliament do that, take upon themselves to sort of like remove a sitting president. So we have this conflict between two democratic processes. The ANC has always been a party that says it's got its own internal democratic culture. And then you've got also parliament, which is also another democratic sort of like institution. So you've got this conflict, and the ANC has always chosen the party over the nation. So, and there's also a view that the easiest way to get rid of a sitting president is through a vote of no confidence, which only requires 51% of MPs, members of parliament, to vote in favor of that vote of no confidence, instead of this 75% vote that was needed, say after the impeachment proceedings had been completed. So they would have had to get 75% of parliamentarians to agree that the president be impeached. So when one looks at these two, the 51% and the 75%, one can see that we find ourselves in the same situation that prevailed so almost like 5 years ago, where a scandal will be used as a form of electioneering. I mean, it's like a parliamentary electioneering, where an issue or a scandal will be used sort of like raised all the time and rehashed, and you have these spurious you'd have these parties throwing mud at each other all the time. Whenever a president goes onto the podium to address parliament or at a public sitting, you'll have these opposition parties sort of like heckling him and all of that. So, I mean, it is said that there are 8 institutions who are dealing with a variety of investigations around criminal or regulatory breaches of the law. This scandal will not go away, because every time a report is released about this Pala scandal, it will the entire thing will the entire thing will play out again, where you have rowdy members, and it's just unsightly how parliament works in South Africa because of these kinds of scandals. And we have presidents who are loath to resign, sort of like fall on their sword. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
No. Very, very concerning. For me, also, is I'm not sure what we're faced with. I don't know if. So I see three things in front of us, right? So one, maybe this is a failure of constitutionalism, given the various clear views that are expressed challenging the president's fitness to do his job, whether that be due to him breaking the law or whether that be due to internal party dynamics. But there seems to be this sentiment that's not going away. So I don't know, given that this is also the second time that the ANC has done this through parliamentary bodies. The first time I was surprised by this was concerning former Minister of Health, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, when he was absolved despite clear wrongdoing that was found in the Digital Vibes case, when the Ethics Committee of Parliament decided that by virtue of his son no longer living in the same household as the former minister, then that doesn't mean that he's no longer classified as the minister's son, which was a strange grounds to absolve him on. And despite this, so I think also the lumping in of these two factors, I think where most people seem to be divided is, yes, maybe there was wrongdoing, but does this warrant an impeachment? But at the end of the day, I think these things were lumped together to create this confusion, and obviously people feel, yes, there might be wrongdoing, but it may not warrant, impeachment, and some feel obviously that it does. And so this was a large part the departure point. And it's also then quite ironic that at the national conference of the ANC, this the two, President Ramaphosa and former Minister of Health Zweli Mkhize were contesting, for the role of president of the movement. And so it's almost also as though South Africa, the dynamics are reflecting the confusion among South Africans. At the same time, the ANC seems unclear amongst itself. Where is all this conversation we had about step aside policy when we find ourselves here? You're saying 8 institutions currently doing investigations. And, the options presented to the ANC, it's either, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who left Parliament, under this cloud of being absolved, despite these clearly, issues around conflict of interest that could have arose from that Digital Vibe saga, and versus the president who's now faced with his own saga in Palapala. So all these contradictions, but at the end of the day, I think the president has survived. He's gotten himself re-elected as the president of the ANC, and I think he's likely to get a second term. So it now starts that whole process of electioneering as we lead up to the next presidential elections.
Yeah, we've had to choose between two devils. That's a South African thing.
Precise. On that note, that takes us to the second story in the essay update. Eskom CEO resigns amidst worsening load shedding. So the Eskom Group Chief Executive Andre de Ruyter tendered his resignation amidst a deepening energy crisis and worsening load shedding. Mr. de Ruyter has agreed to remain at Eskom until 31 March 2023 to smoothen the transition and his replacement. Meanwhile, load shedding has returned to stage 6 due to breakdowns in planned maintenance. Eskom reported that 8,000 megawatts of its generator capacity is on planned maintenance and another 16.6 thousand megawatts is unavailable due to breakdowns. So also the breakdowns have led to excessive use of diesel turbines, resulting in diesel shortages. Eskom's ad hoc request for assistance to make a large-scale purchase of diesel was rejected for procedural reasons by National Treasury last week. Smoo, any thoughts on this saga?
It's another one. I mean, we talked about it earlier, how these blackouts affect the economy. I mean, a little over half of Eskom's installed capacity is unusable or it is unavailable.
Yeah.
So this is detrimental to the country because this results on a direct estimated loss of around 220 billion rand for the year of 2022. The country's economy has just lost over 1 trillion rand in 2022 in direct and indirect costs. That is achieved using the government's accepted COUE calculations, which are given out by NERSA. So that is about 15% of the country's GDP lost. So my view is that Andre de Ruyter should have resigned ages ago. I mean, Andre and his management cohort have run around, have run out of ideas. They've been saying that they will stop this, and they've given us many promises, but nothing ever works. I mean, so there is a lack of business confidence in the country, and there's just a general loss of trust in governance generally. So the main task for Eskom was their main task was to make sure that we have uninterrupted supply. There are no blackouts, and the new management board was told to get rid of blackouts. At least we should be sitting with no more than 2,000 megawatts of maximum of unavailable power. I mean, what they call stage 2 load shedding. That should be the maximum, 2,000 megawatts, instead of what did you say, 6,000. So the Minister of Finance, Kino Kodongwana, has been pushed into a corner by Eskom because some people think that Eskom somehow tries to blackmail government into giving them additional funds, because this time around Eskom was looking for 19.5 billion rand for the government to buy diesel on their behalf. Mind you, Eskom has got their own budget, but they've blown out that entire budget of about 11 billion within 6 months, and they've done some reprioritization of their budgets, and they didn't have money for buying emergency diesel. So yeah, I mean, also the government, the national government, national treasury, has already bailed out Eskom. They've already said that they'll be bailing out Eskom, buying Eskom's debt to the tune of about 2/3 of their debt, of their 450 billion rand debt. So I mean, this Mr. Andre de Ruyter had to go, in my view. He has been worst CEO at Eskom, and the country has suffered immensely through his.
Such a terrible legacy that you'll have, but yeah, it's difficult times. I think it's just sad that without Eskom, we're as good as a two-legged table as an economy and as a country.
Yes.
The blackouts are just so severe, and the challenges, the network industries that are linked to this, because once cell phone towers are out, connectivity is out, and it just cascades down. I have colleagues that I work with who are based in DRC, which also has severe blackout problems. And you'll be surprised at how that also, because of the movement of people, affects people's ability to work completely. So most people actually can only work in the evening between 5 and 8 p.m. Then they have to rush home so that they can have dinner and be in bed by midnight, because electricity comes over 4 hours from midnight to in the morning, so they can charge devices, etc. But throughout the day, just hamstrung, they cannot move, and connectivity and other issues affect their ability to even operate. So we're basically at the doorstep of such a crisis as a country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Note that takes us to the last story in the SA update. President suspends Judge Hlophe. President Cyril Ramaphosa has, on the advice of the Judicial Services Committee, decided to suspend Judge John Hlophe from his duties pending a decision of the National Assembly. The Judicial Conduct Tribunal, JCT, concluded that Judge President Hlophe's conduct breached the Constitution by improperly attempting to influence the two justices of the Constitutional Court to violate their oath of office. In May 2008, 11 justices of the Constitutional Court lodged a complaint with the JSC against Judge President Hlophe for his improper attempt to influence the outcome of certain cases pending before the Constitutional Court in favor of former President Jacob Zuma. The JCT established that Judge Hlophe's behavior seriously threatened and interfered with the independence, impartiality, dignity, and effectiveness of the Constitutional Court and further undermined public confidence in the judicial system. The JSC has referred the matter to Parliament for the National Assembly to institute impeachment proceedings against Judge President Hlophe. Smooth.
Well, I don't have the correct training to drill down into the finer details about this case. What I do know is that this is one of those cases that have dragged on for a decade, if not longer. I mean, also the timing of this suspension, in the same way as it's done in the same way as that of the public protector. It's just a curious one for me. And so many people also say that the reason for that is that this suspension comes straight after on the heels of that Section 89 independent panel report we talked about earlier, which has been challenged legally. And some say if there are more challenges to it, this case could find its way into Judge Hlophe's desk, and he might have an influence on the outcomes of, or in terms of sort of like allocating a judge onto that case, and that could jeopardize the president's chances. So, but anyway, I'm not one for conspiracies, so I will only point out that South African judicial space is highly contested.
Sure.
I'd say it's even politicized, because our system of governance is peculiar in that we have a constitutional democracy, which means judges hold the highest office, basically. So yeah, it's one of those conundrums.
Yeah. And it's all about the timing as well of all these suspensions. I mean, the advice of the Judicial Services Committee came in July, or the end of July, and I think the president says he's taken a while to apply himself due to the complexity of the matter. And but it seems that he does have a couple of these loaded guns that he's not scared to use when he has to. So it's interesting to see really how this, I was just thinking about it, after the failed impeachment attempt, and how the tables have turned. Because not so long ago, I think, when former President Jacob Zuma had survived all of his votes of no confidence, it was, President Cyril Ramaphosa was begging him to vacate office after the last one that he survived, and and to see where he is now, that he's facing, I think, his first, if not second, failed impeachment attempt. So, yeah, how the mighty have fallen. On that note, that brings an end to the SA update this month, and that takes us to the Africa Regional Update. The Africa Regional Update in brief: the AU condemns a failed coup attempt in Sao Tome and Principe, and the summit of the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States was held in Luanda on the 9th of December. The U.S. Africa Leaders Summit was held in Washington on the 13th until the 15th of December. And on that note,
Safi,
sure.
No, I just wanted to ask you, Sao Tome and Principe, where is it actually? Is it in the same ECOWAS region? Is it not?
Yes. So I think it's up in the West Africa the northern oceans, the northwestern oceans, and it's arpeggio, meaning just a small island group of islands, if I'm not mistaken. Let me,
Yeah.
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, it's near. Yeah, here we go. It's actually closer to Central Africa, just off the coast of Gabon.
Of Gabon, okay. It's not part of ECOWAS, okay.
I was actually, I think, mixing it up with Cabo Verde, which is, I think, further northwest.
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah, so this
yes,
is
yeah,
actually, I
yeah.
think, what I would consider just the armpit or opposite the Horn of Africa region, just near Central.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a single island state, not a appellation. So,
Yeah.
small country, they've just survived a coup attempt on the 25th of November. And it's a real concern where, things will end up in terms of unconstitutional changes in power, given that, even ECOWAS is still dealing with the cases in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, as we'll see in the African region.
Mm.
On that note, brings us to a reminder to all our listeners on whatever platform you're listening through, hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all future updates from Ubuntunomics. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. On that note, that brings us to the first story in the Africa Regional Update, the ECOWAS 62nd Ordinary Summit. The 62nd Ordinary Session of the Authorities of Heads of State and Government of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, was held in Abuja to consider reports from the Council of Ministers meetings. The summit also held a foundation-laying ceremony at the new ECOWAS headquarters buildings funded by the Government of the People's Republic of China. Summit considered reports on the transition to civilian rule and political developments in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. Summit noted the commitments from the transitional authorities to respect the 24-month transition timetables in Burkina Faso and Guinea, and expressed concern over the worsening insecurity in Burkina Faso, and also proposed a gradual lifting of economic and financial sanctions against the transitional authorities in Guinea. Summit noted the progress of establishing a multi-stakeholder joint monitoring and evaluation mechanism of the transition timetable in Mali, and Summit also extended the implementation plan for establishing the ECOWAS Customs Union by 5 years, whilst instructing the Ministerial Committee on the Single Currency Program of ECOWAS to find consensus on the outstanding matters towards establishing a conducive environment for the launch of the eco currency by 2027. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the ECOWAS Customs Union will really solidify and yield benefit for all if it is consummated by this single unit of account that they're talking about. I mean, the bloc must speed up the work of the single currency program. It would be an added bonus if their work could be completed, say, a year earlier, so that they can run tests. I mean, test out the system so that they can iron out all the nitty-gritties around this single currency. I mean, a single currency could also be weaponized. We've seen how currencies are weaponized throughout the globe. Weaponized for good in this instance, as a swift sanction tool for errant governments. I mean, the eco currency would deal effectively as a stick against all of these governments and these people who can't meet their transition timelines, transitioning into from military to civilian rule. I mean, they make commitments, but they drag their feet. Now, a single currency used as a tool could act also as a deterrent against those who are plotting all of these coups, because they know that they will be they'll receive direct individual sanctions at the same time. So the best use would be for, in my view, the best use for a single currency would be for these intergovernmental investments where you have 3 or 4 governments. If they're using a single currency, it irons out all the currency fluctuation challenges. So I think this is a very good initiative. They should just speed it up and start using it so that they can iron out all because there are bound to be glitches here and there. So I think this is a good move.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I've got quite a lot to say on this. I mean, obviously, this is one of my areas of specialization, regional integration. So, I think, yeah. So, for me, the story is kind of positive and a bit negative, and I think it's actually a bit confusing to tell where and which direction ECOWAS region is going. I think if we park, for example, some of the challenges they're facing on the security side, I think for one, and just look at just the economics of their regional integration. I think the bigger problem for them has been to harmonize between the Francophone region, which is the West Africa Francophone region, which is part of the WAEMU, the West African Economic and Monetary Union. So these are basically the countries that are under the CFA Franc zone, right? Versus what is predominantly Anglophone in other countries which aren't part of that West Africa Franc region. And also balancing of bigger countries such as Nigeria versus smaller economies but still very regionally influential such as Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire in the context of huge spaces that are very different. Some of the Sahel countries are very, very different, even though they're part of the Francophone region, compared to the coastal French or Francophone countries. So there are all these challenges which I think may be seeming subtle, but are actually quite significant in terms of how do you balance them within the regional community. So firstly, you find that the West Africa Franc zone is at a more advanced stage compared to the rest in terms of its own integration. So it benefits from the fixed exchange rate guaranteed by the French National Treasury, etc. And that's something that's been politically contentious recently, to the extent that in 2019 the French government signed a new agreement. And part of the outstanding matters are how the French government is now withdrawing some of its control of the regional financial institutions, such as the regional central bank of the CFA French zone in West Africa. So that, and comparing to other countries which are significantly much bigger but have even than the entire region, such as Nigeria, but are not part of a single currency. So I think it is positive in that it is unifying and creating deepening regional integration amongst the West African countries. But where I see the huge challenges in future are around issues of policy, given that just based on the economic size, what a smaller country like Benin might need in terms of economic response to external shocks differs vastly to what Nigeria might mean. And Nigeria has had quite significant depreciation or fluctuation of the naira against the dollar, versus the other region, which has had very, very stable due to the fixed exchange rate regime, but also very stable prices on the back of that. So there's a difficulty ahead, and I think the approach that the West African region is taking, in the fact that these regions are not at the same level of development, is confusing. So typically people argue that the stages in terms of regional integration don't matter, but I think it, in some extent, the trade and the integration needs to build on itself, right? You start off by exchanging goods and the trade, and you become a trade area. From there you start allowing people to move and capital to move, and so you become a customs area, because now you're sharing more detailed and relationship based information on your customs. Then from there you become a sort of currency or a monetary union, where now basically your policies are unified. So I don't think that you can have certain parts that are at a monetary union stage trying to integrate with some parts which are still in a free trade area without establishing any of the institutions, let alone just the relationships and the flows of people and money that need to be established before you get to a deeper level of integration. So, yeah, for me, I'm worried about the future of the ECO, but I do think that the region has got a great potential, but they've still got a very, very long way to go.
Yeah, I agree with you somewhat because I just remembered a place, a country like Ghana, which is currently experiencing a lot of turmoil in terms of debt. They're highly indebted, and their city is under pressure, and they've got very high inflation as a result. So yeah, you have a point there. They need to tread carefully. Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. And I think what other regions, for example, the SADC region or SACU particularly, has a benefit of is the long established historical relations between the countries, South Africa, Namibia, Lesotho, and Eswatini. And hence, even amongst the countries, the different needs of each country is accommodated. That Botswana realizes it cannot be part of the monetary union because that ties its policy, and it wants it values its policy sovereignty much more, and hence in the region itself there's differentiation that accommodates that. But I'm not certain how easily the West African region is going to move to this single currency by 2027, given the huge gaps and not a long existing relations that need to be established in order to deepen the integration process.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the last point I wanted to make also on this is that the regional integration process isn't an organic process either. I think it's a political process and thus needs a sponsor. And typically, what you find is that it's the bigger economies that become the sponsors and want to actually direct the policy process and the political process. In the case of European Union, it's quite clear that Germany and France are quite big, and have a lot of sway as well. They typically are the sponsors. Similarly, in the case of SACU, South Africa is the sponsor. And so this is good when times are good and your sponsor is making real good returns, the economy is growing, etc. But it's worse and terrible in cases when the economy of the sponsor is not doing good, because that can permeate throughout the region. This has been the case in the SACU or SADC case due to the South African economy slowdown over the last 10, 15 years. Countries near us and linked to us like Eswatini and Lesotho have had a severe impact as a result of this, because these economies eventually, not only through the trade ties but the integration process, they end up being attached or linked to the economic performance of South Africa. And because of the dominant size of South Africa in the regional economy, then that has an impact that ripples. In the SADC case, as a result of the slowdown, South Africa has actually decreased its contribution from a production point of view from about 65% of the SADC GDP to where we are now at around 47 to about 49% of the SADC regional GDP. So it really permeates throughout. This thing is a fluid thing and it's constantly moving, because despite that, in the SADC region, there's still some countries that are doing tremendously well, such as Tanzania and Angola, which has continuously grown at above average rates, and so there becomes new sponsors eventually. But obviously, this is not a process that is organic or one that is smooth.
Yeah. To add on to that, even the unemployment rate in places like Eswatini and Lesotho is similar to that of South Africa, at around about 35%. You make a good point.
Yeah, the integration process does link to this sort of mirroring. And yeah, as I say, if the sponsor, in terms of the bigger economy, the largest economy in the region, is doing well, that's good for everyone. and it's just terrible when that economy is faced with a crisis. All right.
Yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update is the Milestone Agreement towards civilian rule in Sudan. The Sudanese Sovereign Council and some of the civil political parties signed a framework agreement towards civilian rule. This framework agreement outlines the structures for a return to a civilian-led transition towards democracy and the military's commitment to withdraw from politics. The African Union supported calls on the trilateral mechanism to continue to support Sudanese stakeholders in the next phase of consultations by fostering broad-based consultations and dialogue between parties. This is expected to lay the groundwork for a final agreement and to address critical issues that the signatories of the political agreement agreed to further discuss. Security sector reforms, transitional justice, the Juba Peace Agreement, the Dismantling Committee, the East, and the economy. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, let me just let me look at the challenges or items that need further discussion. For starters, it is apparent that a return to civilian rule rests squarely on the Sudanese government, moving away. I mean that is the Sudanese government is the military. The military should move away from active politics and confine themselves to army barracks, and then commit to serving an elected civilian head of state and that country's government. I mean, security sector reform will be very difficult to achieve because, as we know, Sudan has been militarized for a very, very long time. Alongside this will be the mammoth task of judicial reforms, or what they call transitional justice. One must also bear in mind that the country has deep roots in of Islamic law, Sharia law, which has infused itself into that country's traditional cultures. So over and above this, there's also the dynamics surrounding the different types of interpretation of that very same Sharia law. I'm talking about the various minorities to the west of the country, in Darfur, in places like Darfur. And they also have to take into consideration that they are animists and Christians to the east. That's the east is also a big factor in places like Kordofan. So there are challenges and opportunities to be, especially if they can get the economy right. I mean, the country is still underdeveloped. So if they could get sort of like a sponsor, like you were saying, there's these friends of Sudan, all of these developed countries in the EU and in the West, they should try sponsor Sudan's development if they want change in that part of the world. So for too long, the economy has been moderately centrally planned, with subsidies, fuel subsidies, because Sudan was a producer is an oil producer, and now with most of those oil wells going to South Sudan, they no longer can afford subsidies, so they'll have to find ways to transition. They have to do this carefully, and they must circumspect, because especially concerning IMF and World Bank imposed models, because they haven't worked in the recent past. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Definitely, and I think, look, this is also a place where we were discussing an extension of these transitional plans, not some 6 or 8 months ago. So I think it is quite positive that they've reached this milestone, but yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and this is just the beginning.
Yeah. Yep.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update on more action needed for Africa to reach SDG targets. So the corona pandemic and the war in Ukraine and climate change have all hindered progress towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals SDGs in Africa. The latest status report on the SDGs presented during the African Economic Conference 2022 shows that without renewed efforts, nearly 492 million African citizens will be left in extreme poverty by 2030. And this number is expected to decrease slightly to 350 million by 2050. So to get back on track, African countries need to foster domestic resource mobilization and savings, as well as boost information and communication technology infrastructure to drive achievements of the SDGs and the Agenda 2063.
I think South Africa needs some sort of like a Marshall Plan, because what they point to is a problem, fostering domestic resource mobilization and savings. Africa does not have savings, and there are no resources. I mean, more than half the markets are in South Africa, basically. Like something like 75% of the continent's capital markets are in South Africa, and Africa just needs to get money from elsewhere, somewhere, and we can do this through trade, maybe, through access to external markets. But what we yeah no this point, I mean, fostering domestic resource mobilization is a huge challenge, and we've been talking about this subject for almost 2 years now.
Sure. Look, I think it's a bit of a conundrum to me, and I agree to you. Like, I mean, without being too conspiratory, a large part of the reason why Africa has no savings or wealth is because of, the looting during colonialism. And this shows itself in the distribution of global wealth. In any case, we are where we are today, and my bigger concern is that I think, given this challenge of no savings and no wealth, we end up going to international markets to borrow, and often in foreign currency. And I think that's the risk that, is fine when you're doing well, but countries like Ghana and Zambia will tell you that it's a nightmare when your economy is not able to export and remain attractive to these global markets. So I think for me, that's two things. Yes, I agree with you 100%. We need to be given more access, and I think more equitable access. I don't think that this, is echoed enough, and I think this can also be taken on by part of the advanced economies, through perhaps, tax cuts for foreign investments in Africa. And I think African countries and African governments and capital markets need to advance themselves enough to provide local currency products, right, that can insulate local markets from that exchange risk. Because this is crucially what is holding us back as an economy and, holding us from our development. As you rightfully put, the challenge of capital, the lack of capital, no deep capital markets or non-existing capital markets. But the other flip side is that if we are to able to access global markets, we then face the exchange rate risk challenge. And I think, for equitable access, I think we need to find products that encourage local currency lending through some kind of mechanism, obviously, that allows foreign participation, but ultimately to neutralize the exchange rate risk. I mean, this is crucially one of the biggest portions of risk, apart from obviously political risk, in terms of how Africa as an investment destination is seen by international investors. On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update, and that takes us to the Global Geopolitics Update. The Global Geopolitics Update, in brief, is that the meeting of the Supreme Eurasian Economic Council was held on the 9th of December, and Argentina wins the 2022 FIFA World Cup on the 18th of December. And the 9th Review Conference of the Biological Weapons Convention was held in Geneva on the 28th until the 16th of December. On that note, that takes us to the last reminder to our listeners on whatever platform you're listening through. Hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all future updates from Ubuntunomics. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and share it amongst your family and friends. On that note, that takes us to the first story in the Global Geopolitics update, the China Latin America Defense Forum. The People's Republic of China hosted a virtual defense forum with officers of national defense departments from 24 Latin American and Caribbean countries on the 13th of December. The Chinese Defense Minister, Wei Feng, called on Latin American countries to strengthen unity, cooperate to combat risks and challenges, and to contribute more to peace and stability in the region and around the world. The cooperation between China and Latin American countries focuses on the economy and trade. Defense cooperation is characterized mainly by military and technical support, which excludes any Chinese military interference in the Latin American affairs. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, okay. For starters, let me congratulate Argentina for winning the 2022 FIFA World Cup. I should have said that when you were doing the updates in brief. Yeah, I think they last got the cup. They last won the cup back in the 80s, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So congratulations to them.
Big ups to Messi. I think he's officially the GOAT. I know they've been this.
Yes.
Well, it started off as a what do you call it? A three-way fight between CR and Mbappe and Messi, which became now a clear fight between Mbappe and Messi. And big ups to Messi on finally taking it home.
Yeah. And Mbappe is one for the future. He's already got a medal, the gold medal. But it was exciting watching them play that final. It was the most exciting World Cup final I've ever watched. Anyways,
No doubt.
Yeah, we're not a sports podcast. Okay. Getting back to Syria, the more serious stuff. I saw recently a map showing how governments oscillated between neoliberalism and a modicum of socialism. Over the past 3 decades, they showed this map of Latin America, South America. And it's so interesting that in the last 2 years, much of Latin America has shifted back towards socialism because we had a decade and a half where they were market fundamentalists. And I should also point out that the American army was instrumental in regime changes back in the 1980s and 1990s that brought about neoliberalism to Latin America. So it's interesting seeing that they are now having these defense, these war games with China.
Yeah. For me, look, this is one of those things. Well, apparently it is the fifth such summit, but for me, I think it might also speak to China stepping up its game closer towards the U.S., I guess. And some sentiment is that as China starts having more of an influence within Latin American countries, this obviously becomes an incursion of some kind of threat to the dominance that the U.S. currently has within the region across the Americas and obviously the rest of the world. And I think it is one of those strategic moves, just the same way, for example, the recent acquisition of a base, I think, by China. I'm not certain if it's the Central African Republic or Gabon, but along the west coast, has definitely piqued the concern of the U.S. military. And I remember some weeks back Blinken giving a press statement about this or the other. So I do think that it is heating up in terms of the tensions, given the Russia-Ukraine issues and what we termed at the beginning of this war the Cold War 2.0. And I think this forum is just one of many that these countries are trying to set them pieces up. And same thing with the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, as we'll see later on in the podcast. On that note, that takes us to the second story in the Global Geopolitics update. The U.S. Fed raises rates by 50 basis points. The United States Federal Reserve Monetary Policy Committee decided to raise its policy interest rate by 50 basis points, increasing the target range for the federal funds to 4.2% to 4.5%. And the committee anticipates that the ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate to attain a stance of monetary policy that's sufficient to return inflation to 2% over time. Currently, U.S. inflation remains elevated at 6.2% in September, which is slightly down, or at 6% in September, slightly down from 6.2% in August. Smooth?
Yeah, this one. I still don't think policy interest rate hikes for federal funds are the best tool. I mean, when we look at the genesis of the inflation problem, we can see how this entire thing came about. Back in 2020, the COVID pandemic caused a recession when the supply side of the economy collapsed because of workplace shutdowns and safety concerns. This then created a demand side problem as wages and other incomes fell due to rising unemployment. Then there were the long and complex supply chains, chain problems, which compounded the problem. And then you have China's zero COVID policy, which continues to delay a full recovery. So the pandemic relief back in the US and in some countries to help to restore demand, although spending patterns were unusual because there were more goods and fewer services because consumers avoided contact. Things like Uber Eats and all of that. So the supply side constraints produced a drop in demand somewhat. While demand has largely recovered in recent months, the supply side has not. The continuing inflation pressures still come mostly from the supply side. It is also due to decades of underinvestment in infrastructure in the US. All of this has been due largely to a misunderstanding of the true constraints and the nature of the inflation pressures that come from the supply side. Believe that the problem was excess demand, which is still the case, has led to the adoption of austere fiscal policy. If they abandon this misguided austerity and replace it with a well-designed investment and targeted social spending, then there might be some relief. Those are my thoughts. And then also you have this the inflation, the US, the inflation bill, which Biden introduced, and that has compounded the problem because instead of getting all that cheap stuff from China, they've said we want to buy American, and so this inflation is being shipped over to the EU because suddenly America is sort of like subsidizing their manufacturers. And the EU is very unhappy because it's unfair. They consider these unfair policies, trade policies. So it's a complex issue, but it all has to do with supply side constraints.
Sure, definitely agree with you there, and I think without resolving those issues, which were even made worse with the issues now due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that's impact in terms of fuel and energy prices, as well as on the other side the prices of food, given the impact, the contribution of global grains, 40% of them coming from Ukraine. So yeah, without resolving those issues, which inflationary or interest rates increases are not going to deal with, because that deals with demand side inflation, the supply side issues will remain. And as you said, the policy response is going to make matters even worse, albeit that it's kind of shifting who eventually pays for this inflation.
Yep. Yep.
On that note, that takes us to the last story in the Global Geopolitics update, the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. So the United States hosted a 3-day U.S. Africa Partnership Summit with leaders from across the African continent in Washington from the 13th to the 15th of December. And the summit aimed to demonstrate the United States' commitment to Africa and underscore the importance of the U.S.-Africa relations and increased cooperation on global priorities. Delegations from all 49 invited African countries and the African Union, alongside members of civil society and the private sector, attended the summit. Spoon, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, it's all good talk about building strong ties and resolving um, to work collaboratively with African governments in building more inclusive and responsive globe and responsive global institutions. It's not just very nice talk. There's good in it, though. I mean, the investment pledge of 55 billion US dollars over the next 3 years is a very welcome sweetener. So is the establishment of a diaspora council to advance equity and investment opportunities. Another encouraging point is the support for the G20 membership of Africa, which they view as sort of like this single economic entity, somewhat. That I don't know why they view Africa as a single unit, but anyhow, also there is the other point about the U.S. promising to lend $21 billion to low and middle income countries through the IMF for what they call the African Resilience and Recovery thingy. So this is appreciated too, because this $21 billion is some sort of like a guarantee for Africans to get more debt anyhow. But yeah, what is most important in my view is that there is the MOU between the Memorandum of Understanding between the US government and the African AFCFTA, which is the African Free Trade, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. They want to expand trade and boost competitiveness in order to attract investment into the continent, which they estimate will have 1.3 billion people and it will be a 3.5 billion US dollar economy, which will be the fifth largest economy in the world. So this part about opening up supply chains for me and improving trade is what could catapult Africa out of its current state. I mean, in a story before, in a few stories before, we talked about how Africa is struggling with its resources, with resource mobilization. So if they open up their markets for Africans to trade, it would take us out of this underdevelopment in the same way they did with North Korea, and in the same way that Japan benefited in the 1950s all the way up to the 1980s because they could access US markets. So it is the exposure to US markets that also brings capital, because once you become a manufacturing base, capital also flows in, because under I mean, trade could be one of those. Trade is most crucial, because China also did the same. So did Southeast Asia during the globalization era. The West opened up their markets. Okay, and talking about China, China also welcomed this mooted cooperation between Africa and the US, but they want that an Africa-centered partnership is what is needed. That's what China said. They say that African people are in the best position to tell what is best needed and suited. So I've just said what we need is markets. That's what we need. So China also said that the US has no place in attacking other countries to gain advantage in Africa, because Mr. Biden made no bones about telling everyone that what they're about is taking China, dealing with China. They want to deal with China, basically. So the US has, China has this One Belt, One Road program, and their investments. Because we, in a story before, in that story about ECOWAS, you talked about China building some public building. Yeah. Yes, at headquarters. Yeah. So it's. I mean, China also has got this Asia Infrastructure Development Bank thing going in Africa. So one has to say that the US will have to make good on their promises, though, because the Chinese just come in, do what they need to do. They don't talk much. They just get on with it. The US there's good talk, but they need to make good. They like to promise, and they've got this tendency of talking on both sides of the mouth. Because a case in point is that there is the newly adopted United Nations resolution, which is called Towards a New International Economic Order. They didn't vote for Africa. Only 123 countries, all middle income and low income countries, voted, the developing world. The 50 developed economies, they voted against this resolution. There's another resolution also called the role of the United Nations in promoting development in the context of globalization and interdependence. That to me is what we are about. That is Ubuntu, independence, and all of that. The US voted against that. So with one side of their mouth, they are giving promises. On the other side, they are voting against the liberal, free economic freedom, basically, of the global South. So yeah.
No, we've said this time and time again, Sbu. I think we've covered it so many times at this point. Like it was sounding like stuck records. If anybody wants to help Africa and these so-called development partners help us deal with the energy crisis, stop giving us constraints to access to financial markets on the basis of projects needing to be either 100% renewable overnight or not have any carbon impact on the globe, given that our impact is relatively negligible if you're going by greenhouse gas emissions. These nuances. If you care about Africa, invest in us being climate resilient. Stop putting, constraints to our access to financing through these loopholes and requiring us to procure from your suppliers if you care about developing, the African market. And I think ultimately, we've said this even in various contexts that the global economy is kind of stuck now, right? Because post World War II, so, some of the boom was, given the war and people had a lot of incomes, and the U.S. market incomes rose so fast that they could no longer produce locally, and they had to outsource that to Asian markets for production. Those markets also reached their level of maturity, and so now it's left to either the world realizing the importance of connecting the African markets and helping the African markets develop, because it is the final frontier when it comes to labor. Unless, obviously, then they're going to go down the route of the fourth industrial revolution and hoping that the robots will take over the labor that humans, can do. I don't think there being any other strategy. It's just a challenge that right now it's not even seen as a priority. We're an afterthought. What they're after is balancing the power of China, not the development of Africa. So it's quite clear.
Exactly.
It's just quite sad that they keep missing this, and you would think, given the numerous things that are quite clear that this is the final paradigm in terms of market developments that still have a lot of potential for growth, that people would be trying to rush and be the first ones in. China has picked that up and they've done that. And instead of learning the lesson of what China is doing, they're just simply trying to balance that power because it undermines their position of privilege. Very short-sighted.
Yep.
On that note, that takes us to the numbers game.
Okay, you're right. I mean, I must get a Christmas bonus this time.
See, this one will be a hat trick, and you'll be the official goat of Ubuntunomics podcast. All right, so this last number is that it's narrowed down to 18.1 billion rand, so minus 18.1 billion, a negative balance in second quarter of 2022. So what do you think this number is regarding?
Okay. I think I follow some of these things closely. It's got to do with the South African Reserve Bank, I think, for starters, because and I think you're making a mistake here. I think it's the third quarter of 2022. That should be the current account of balance of payment.
Wow. Okay. No, 100%. You're right. It's actually the third quarter. And spot on, Smooth. It's actually the current account. So the current account deficit has narrowed down to 18.1 billion in the third quarter of 2022. And the current account balance has improved to a narrower deficit after a deficit of 107 billion in the second quarter, which is around 1.6% of GDP. So this is on the back of South Africa's trade surplus narrowing to 233 billion due to the cost of imports, which increased beyond export growth. So the higher value of export goods reflected an increase in volumes, whilst the import of goods and services mainly reflected higher prices. So there you have it. Slightly improved deficit in the third quarter for South Africa's current account.
Yeah, and we need this because as you heard in the other story, 19 billion rand for Eskom's diesel. That's just one entity, and you have to look at the entire country. And we've got an energy crisis in the country. We are a distant destination. We do not have enough oil reserves or gas reserves, and we should. The better we do with this current account and balance of payments, the better for us, because we import all of this oil and all of these finished goods.
I think it is a challenging time. I'm just doing the numbers just behind a matchbox, and 19 or 20 billion of the 400 billion debt is around 5% of Eskom's debt bill, which is just going to its diesel budget for the rest of this year. So Yeah, this is a serious crisis that we have. On that note, that brings an end to this episode, and we're shutting down as Ubuntunomics podcast. We'll see you in February next year, and we wish you a splendid festive and holiday season with your family and friends and loved ones. Spoo, any final words?
Yes. I wish them a most prosperous new year. We've had bad news, and we've had good news. We've had more good news than bad news. So I wish you all a much better 2023. Yeah, we should work on it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Spoo. On that positive note, let's end it there for this year. Cheers.
Thank you.
Africa.